Um, I don't know about you guys, but there's sometimes you run across things that just kind of make you think of your childhood and bring up old memories. Um, that's kind of how my last week was, a little bit. I found myself living through my children to a small degree. We drove to Wisconsin for a few days to spend some time with my mom and stepdad, and had a good week. And my kids always love going to see Grandma and Grandpa. And I'm only sharing this because I know it won't get back to her. I wouldn't generally share things about my kids in front of because in front of a larger group, but my poor my daughter came down the other night, actually, after I put her to bed, and she was distraught a little bit, and I was like, my initial gut reaction was like, go back to bed, and she just kind of stared at me for a second, and then suddenly just started, the tears just started coming down a little bit, and I'm like, okay, now I feel like a jerk, and asked what was going on, and she just missed Grandma, and it was just kind of a tough turnaround for her, and so we called Grandma, and everything was fine. She was okay. But I told her, I said that her having that rough turnaround reminded me of my own childhood, because we used to drive 9 hours to St. Louis every Christmas when I was a kid to visit my grandparents, and it was always kind of rough. Like, I loved the trip down. Believe it or not, I actually loved the 9 hours going down because it was exciting anticipation. But coming back was always a drag. It's like, I got to go back to school, and Christmas is over, and I'm leaving Grandma and Grandpa behind. It was tough. And so I told her that reminded me of, when I was a kid. I can relate to you, And the story of David and Goliath is very similar because it reminds me of my childhood, because it's a story that I remember being read to me regularly. And that I'm guessing that's probably not the case for many in this room. It's just, for me, I was a pastor's kid, and so I heard Bible stories a lot. And it became something where I heard so regularly that it's like, okay, it's a great story, and it can remind me of my childhood, but how exactly does this story actually impact my life now? So I'm going to read this to you, and I'm hopefully going to help you see how really it has some powerful connections. You can look at not at this point, he's not King David. Later he'll be King David, but David, how he's facing this giant, and how this interaction and understanding what's going on there can actually be something we can relate to very much right now. So here we go. Now Saul, who's King Saul, he's the king of God's people, the Israelites. Okay, that's what they're known as. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. David was very young, okay? So his brothers were fighting. They were with Saul and the army of Israel, and David was back home watching the sheep, okay? And he went to take his brothers' lunch, basically, is what happened. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. Okay, so he comes and he sees this image of these two armies that are going to come after each other. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. So he kind of left things behind to go say hi to his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And I kind of cut that part out. We'll see what he said again in a little bit. But he's basically mocking the Israelites, okay? And he basically was telling them that if you could send out your best fighting man, if you can defeat me, then you'll defeat the entire Philistine army. So basically having this battle one-on-one, and whoever won that battle would win the war, okay? And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. He was 9 feet tall, after all. Big guy, very intense, scary, kind of like I don't know if you ever saw American Gladiators back in the day. It was like, that's like a decade ago now. Yeah, American Gladiators, right? And you have these like skinny guys, like really fast maybe, but then they have these big people, you run into them and they just crush you. You got to stay away from the gladiators. Okay, that's just me. Anyway, they were afraid of him. All right. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant, he's talking about himself, David, will go and fight with the Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth. And he has been a man of war from his youth. This guy's been trained from a little boy to kill people. Okay, David, come on now, man, be smart. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. He's like, I've fought off some things in my time. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. In other words, he's saying this Philistine, this giant is nothing but he's godless. He's living on his own strength, and he's sitting here mocking God. I mean, we can't be hiding behind we can't be hiding from this person. And David's the only one who's willing to stand up. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Note that he says the Lord is his strength. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Then he took off his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Okay, so he got this. You give the image of this 9-foot man of war with a huge sword and shield, and you have this little boy carrying a sling and a couple of stones. It's kind of intimidating. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. Okay? It's kind of like one of those, those people that have very smooth skin. You can tell they don't work with their hands. He looked at this boy. He's like, you are inexperienced. You're young. You're small. This is pathetic. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. You notice David not once has said that, I'm coming to you with my own skill or abilities. No, he says, I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord. It's the Lord who fights for me. And who's defied him? Goliath. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground, dead. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. It's a pretty powerful imagery, that battle between David and Goliath. And really, in the midst of what actually took place physically, it's interesting to see how they interacted with one another and what David said and what Goliath said. I just want you to think, though, before we kind of dig into this and really ask, how is this something that can really bear meaning in my life right now? What is it that you're facing in your own life right now? David and God's people were facing this Philistine army and this giant, okay? Very intimidating situation. Everybody was scared. They were afraid to face him because none of them thought that they could overcome this giant. What are you facing in your own life? What is the giant that currently, is making things rather difficult? Maybe I can put it in better perspective. Goliath, he kind of paraded up and down the hills in the Middle East, right, in front of David and the armies of Israel, the army of Israel. Okay, that's what he was doing, past tense. Difference is, though, your Goliath, what does he do? He doesn't walk around in the hills. He's not off in the Middle East. No, he comes to your workplace. He intrudes in your social outings, in your time with family. The giant in your life comes home, okay? And your giant doesn't carry a sword or a shield. Instead, what he does is he brings you bills you can't pay, people you can't please, substances you can't resist, pornography you can't refuse, a career you can't escape, a past you can't shake, and a future that, well, you don't want to face. What is the result? And so think about that. Like, what is that? What is this giant in your life? The result is the result of outer circumstances, those outer things that this giant brings into our life is inner turmoil. We get depressed, we feel anxious, we get scared, and we find ourselves at the mercy of this giant, and we cower. Maybe a good way of thinking of the giant I'm referring to would be sin, but a more particular, a more defined understanding of how sin is at work in your life. Because that's really what the giant is. A few things I should tell you about Goliath himself. Okay? I want you to just think about that. I want you to get that in your head. Think about what is it at work in your own life right now. Goliath, the one in the story I read, he challenged the Israelites. He challenged God's people morning and night. The Bible says this. It says, for 40 days, twice a day, morning and evening, the Philistine giant strutted in front of the Israelite army. First thing in the morning, he'd come out, and he'd say, come fight me. You can't win. That's the first thing that they heard in the morning. What was the last thing they heard before they went to bed? Come out, fight me. You can't win. It's insurmountable. You know, that giant just dogged them every single day. And I'm guessing your giant probably works in the same way. It's the first thing you think about in the morning. And if it's not necessarily the first thing, it usually pops up pretty quick. It's probably one of the last things you think about before you go to bed. Whatever it is right now, that's probably your giant. And sin works in our lives in big ways and small ways. And when I'm talking about a giant, I would say the way that sin's working in your life, the biggest way, that disease, it's infiltrated you and it's most glaring, okay? How long has your giant stalked you? How long has he been waking you up, shouting at you first thing in the morning, and haunting you as you go to bed? How often has he actually had an impact on what you dream? Here's another thing to think about. So, Goliath was stalking God's people, first thing, last thing, all day long, okay? That's what our giant does. Second thing, Goliath himself and his family, it was an ancient foe. And let me explain what I mean by that. Goliath came from a group of people called the Philistines. And God's people, when they saw Goliath come out, they're like, here we go again. Because they'd been fighting the Philistines for a long time. Okay, a long time. We'll get it up. Don't worry about that. I can keep going without screens. They've been facing them for a long time. And have you ever noticed that a lot of the giants that we face in our own lives oftentimes are giants that kind of come back, that kind of recur? How many people say things like, yeah, I struggle with alcohol just like my dad. Or divorce runs in our family. Or, I don't know, I've always struggled to have friends, but so did my dad. He was kind of a jerk. You know what I mean? We say things like this. These giants in our lives are much like Goliath and the Philistines, okay? They dog us from morning till night, and they're not like a brand new thing half the time. They're things that haunt us long term, and sometimes they come back. You know, oh, I've gotten over this giant. Well, wait, it's just come back. You know, or we can see how that giant is something that's haunted not just me, but generations before me. You know, it's funny how I didn't know. This was something my mom had shared with me that we'd had some people in my family that had struggled with alcohol. I had no idea. I didn't know about that, but I always wondered, like as I was growing up, why I never saw it around the house much. You know, you find out about these things, and it haunts people for generations, and you worry about that. And you got to be careful, you know, about what are some of these giants that tend to kind of go stick in our family. So the question with this is this. Okay, so I think we've done a good job of kind of identifying the giant. Okay, hopefully got it in your head. What is the thing that's haunting you? Okay. The question maybe in your head now is, how do I face it? What do I do? How can I be like David? How can I slay the giant? And there's a couple of wrong questions that can be asked. First one would be this: is my faith strong enough? And what we're saying basically, am I strong enough to take down this giant? And implied in that's what's implied in that statement is how much strength do I have in myself? If I believe in myself enough, and you hear this in our culture a lot, if I believe in myself enough, I can overcome this. Okay? But do you see the problem with that is I'm setting myself up for failure. Because at some point I will fall short. At some point I'm going to feel like that giant is winning. Okay? In fact, you might be in a circumstance right now where you feel like that. It's not like it feels like it's winning. The giant is winning right now. Okay, so that's the number one problem. I'm setting myself up for failure because I have a false understanding of sin. Sin is a disease. It's not something that just goes away. I always have it. So if I have to have enough faith in myself to overcome this, I'm going to be in trouble. On the flip side, if I'm going to talk about my faith in God and ask the question, is my faith in God strong enough? Once again, I'm setting myself up for trouble because if I'm saying that I need to have enough faith in God, then my circumstances will get better and this giant will just go away, well, then I don't have the right God. Because that's not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible never says that I'm going to have an easy life, that circumstances are just going to get easy if I have enough faith in Him, or if I trust in Him enough, all these temptations and trials in my life are just going to go away. The Bible doesn't talk about that. So this is the worst question I could start with. Is my faith strong enough? Second question, and this we ask this question many different ways. And every time I talk to somebody who has a problem, this is what we always jump to right away. What must I do? What is the winning formula? So I need to get 3 stones from the brook, get a sling, right? And I got to make sure I hit on the first one because the next 2 aren't going to, I'm going to, what I mean? It's like, what did David do? I must do as David did. And so, we talk to other people who maybe have a similar struggle, which isn't a bad thing. It can be very good, and we can learn from one another. This is a good thing. But the problem is we're all different, and sin is at work on all of our lives, okay? And so if my first question is, what must I do? Once again, I would argue that I'm setting myself up for failure, because what happens, even if I have the winning formula to knock down that giant, what's waiting behind him? What do you think's waiting behind the first giant? His brother. Thank you. The next one. There's always another giant. There's always another giant. And that's one of the things, that's what I've found sometimes to be so exhausting about life at times when, just when you kind of get on the high, you're on top of the world, that you know what's coming next, right? You're coming down because there's another giant right around the corner. And do you see, this is why the Bible does not at its core say that life is all about me fixing my own problems and me doing. Because if that's my starting point, I'm setting myself up for an exhausted life, and I'm going to constantly be looking myself in the mirror and saying that I'm worthless because I can't beat this giant. And look at those people over there; they beat all their giants. Yeah, right. We can put on a good facade sometimes, but nobody can beat all their giants on their own. Here's the correct question to ask. This is what I would argue: who is my higher power? What is my higher power? In the 12 steps, I've found that steps 1 and 2 are incredibly powerful because to admit my powerlessness and to acknowledge that I need a higher power is incredibly important. Because to say that I'm powerless means that I am a sinner, means that I truly cannot control everything in life. It truly means that there is no perfect winning formula for overcoming this giant, okay? And it means that in order to face this current struggle, whatever it may be, I must turn to a higher power because only a power higher than myself can restore me to sanity and can remind me who I am not. I am not God. Okay? It's incredibly important to remember that because David is a perfect example of this. Okay? David defeated Goliath, but what was waiting after Goliath? What did I say before? Another giant, right? David fell repeatedly. This is a guy who wrote Psalms in the Bible. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Yeah, guess what? The guy who wrote that, he slept with another man's wife, and he had her husband killed later on. Really? So I need to be just like David. And David, who, yes, he's considered to be a man after the Lord's heart, and yes, he's considered to be this, a great man of faith, but he was a greater sinner. He had a dysfunctional family. In fact, one of his own kids tried to kill him later on. I mean, these are the types of people in the Bible. The Bible is not about role models. It's about people who need God's grace and who truly need to look at God and see him as he is, recognize who they are, sinners in need of his love, and recognize how he restores them to sanity. It's really how it works. And this is why when you hear the story of David and Goliath, I think it's important to see David and Goliath. I should say David in this story is really a foreshadowing of Jesus himself. And that's why, ultimately Jesus has to be my higher power because he's the only one who truly will never fail me. He's the one who's always there for me. He's the only one who promises to conquer every giant in my path. Imagine David going out there to see Goliath. And Goliath is out there with his hammer. He's got his shield and his sword. He's pounding it. And what does David do? He goes out there, and on one side you have God's people. On the other side you have the enemy. And David goes out to meet the enemy on behalf of all of God's people. That's really what's happening there. David's like, I will fight this giant in the name of the Lord. What did Jesus do? Jesus did the exact same thing. He did that for you. You have this giant out there pounding he's got his sword and he's got that shield, he's pounding, he's looking at you saying, you can't beat me. You got me, I control you. You come after me, you're going to fall. And Jesus says, no, you stay back. I got this. He goes out there and he meets the giant. And he defeats the giant. Problem is here, and this is what you really see ultimately on the cross, a true and greater David, the giant slayer. So often we find our security in being giant slayers. Have you ever realized that? Look at me. Look what I've done. I'm a giant slayer. I took care of this. I do that. I'm successful. I'm powerful. That's what we do. We all do it in different ways. We say it in different ways, but that's what we do. We claim to be giant slayers. And so what I'm really doing is I'm not building myself up on Jesus and on God, who is my true security and hope. Instead, I'm building myself up on myself. This is something that I've had to work through myself a lot of times, When things don't go as I like them to go. I'll give you an example. We're switching to Saturdays next week. That makes me really nervous. You might have seen it. I mean, I'm talking to somebody like, it's going to Saturday. You guys can make sure you come, please. I'd like it if you come. It's insecurity. It's total insecurity. It's like I want to control this. I want people to come. And what am I saying? I'm saying it's all up to me, right? The Bible says to, preach, speak the good news of Jesus, share the word, be faithful in doing so, and God's word does not return empty. Share Jesus, and that's what David reminds me is that Jesus is out there. He's facing these giants for me, okay, including my own insecurity, and he reminds me that he paid the price for my insecurity on that cross, okay, and he reminds me that tomorrow is going to be a new day. This is what it says in Romans chapter 8:37. It says, I love this line, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. It's a line, it's a one sentence in a much bigger chunk of the Bible, Romans chapter 8, beautiful chapter of the Bible. Oftentimes it's read at funerals. And can you imagine reading this at a funeral? We are more than conquerors through him who loved us. I mean, when you see a dead body in a church, what do you think of right away? That person lost. They lost their battle. They lost their battle with cancer. They lost their battle with that struggle, with that demon, with that giant. That giant slayed that person. No, and what you do is you can stand up in front of a bunch of people through Christ, and you can say, no, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Because of his love, because of his sacrifice on the cross, the giant has been slain. Satan is defeated. Sin is no more. That is, it may not be something we see all the time, but deep down inside, that truth penetrates. And it changes the way I look at everything, including death itself. And I can look at that person lying there, and I can also remember what it says earlier in Romans 8:18, where it says, the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed to us. Victory is assured through Jesus. I have won already. So why am I so depressed? Well, I'm depressed because sin still hangs on to me. That's a reality. But at the same time, as sin hangs on to me, and yes, I should be sad when I see death, when I see suffering and hardship in the world, at the same time, I hang on to Jesus who is dying on the cross for me because I know right there I have the image of victory. And Jesus didn't stay dead. And his reminder to me is that tomorrow is always a new day, and one day every giant will be laid to the ground, will be laid waste. And we will rejoice together. And it's like this image that God gives to us, this image of victory that's not just an inner reality, but a visible reality that we all see. It's something that he holds out in front of us as this beautiful thing that we're called to strive toward and to reach toward, even as we're struggling with sin in the present. And it's not something that I can really do on my own. It's Christ who gives me strength. It's what he's done that continues pushing me forward as I get worn down by the world. And I guess that's what I want to leave you with today, is this simple yet powerful reality that Jesus is your giant slayer. You don't have to be the giant slayer. And do you see how freeing that is? To just say, I don't have to be the giant slayer. Jesus slays the giant for me. And he gives me the strength to face that giant when I wake up in the morning and I can say, guess what? You've already lost. Lord, give me the strength to get through this day, to face my insecurities, and to remember always that you're my hope.